Welcome. My name is Jeffrey Rubenstein, and this is Sans Apologia. This is a podcast to discuss in depth a variety of topics such as creativity, history, current events, music, art, spirituality, philosophy, or any other topic with which I can foster a rich, dispassionate, and well-referenced dialogue with a range of knowledgeable people that I'll have on as guests each week right here on this podcast. The idea would be to supplement the discussion with references. Listeners could then check the website for links to any of the sources we discuss. Feel free to message with questions and comments, and I could take calls in future episodes. So first, I'd like to welcome our guest today, Dan Funk. Over the years, Dan has been a great source of information, particularly about Eastern religions and more recently Native American spirituality. He's traveled extensively throughout India and has studied Hare Krishna for well over a decade, and someone who, in our conversations over the years, really has explored a central question that we're going to discuss here today. Welcome to the show, Dan.
Thanks for having me.
Today, we're going to discuss a little bit more about something that you and I have spent a lot of time talking about over the years, and that is how you balance the spiritual mindset in the everyday world with all of its inconveniences and annoyances and just all that takes us out of what we might think of as a spiritual mindset. Christians might interpret it as the struggle between living a godly life in such a sinful world. Buddhists might describe it as maintaining mindfulness. So I did some research, and I came across a very interesting Japanese concept, nyoho, or making even our smallest mundane actions accord with the Dharma. I found this on a very good website called Zen Studies Podcast. I highly recommend it, and they go into much greater detail than we're going to obviously have a chance to do here today. But just to focus on that one idea, that discipline in our daily action is an opportunity to practice Dharma or mindfulness or whatever you want to call it. So first, Dan, let me ask you, how would you define Dharma?
That's an interesting question because I think in Sanskrit, it could be defined in many different ways. One would be work or the essential nature of something. So it's something I've struggled with my whole life, like what is my actual Dharma? And the example they give is the Dharma of water is to be wet. Mm-hmm. It doesn't have to think about it. It just is. Most people may think that's their occupation. So that could be like the first base level. It could also be a religious duty, familial duty, mm-hmm. Many of those different layered things.
And who defines it this way?
The Bhagavad Gita in Sanskrit.
Okay.
Yep, and the Vedas.
Okay. Now, as someone who has spent a lot of time studying various philosophies, would you describe yourself as an adherent or a student, a scholar of a particular philosophy?
I think at one time, sure, like you get to the point where, I've studied the Bhagavad Gita and Vaishnavism, Eastern religion, worship of Vishnu, and I've been a monk in that path. And then I always had the backing of Native American ceremonies early on, and now that's been grounding me a lot more lately. And I think you and I have talked about that. You've had some experiences with Lakota ceremonies yourself. And I think this gets to what we're really talking about here is the balance, right? So, and it's how you define what's spiritual, what's material. I mean, I think the short answer from any philosopher, spiritual adherent, let's say Alan Watts or Joseph Campbell, there's not really any difference,
right?
If you get to that realized level,
right?
And in the Western world, we have a mechanistic view of everything. So there's this dualistic view, whereas and we're surrounded by technology.
Okay, so
So
let me
since
let me
New,
reset two things right here because these are two big things that I want to talk about today. The first one that you touched upon briefly is your personal experiences with both Eastern philosophies and then more recently Native American spirituality. So not right now, but in a little bit later, I would like to ask you some of the similarities that you see between the two, or if you see things that are unique in each one. And the second thing that I want to make sure that we talk about is something you're now touching upon. And that is basically, where does this separation come from? If I could just read this quote. Recently, the MacArthur Genius Fellow Carl Safina argues that the climate crisis, of all things, has its roots in Western philosophy, tracing modernity's disconnection and objectification of nature to Plato's distinction between this profane world and his metaphysical world of perfect forms. So that speaks directly to what you're talking about, where this split comes from. Is it the case that our own Western civilization is premised upon a separation of the spiritual and the mundane, and that's why it's so difficult for us to balance those two?
I would say yes to that. I think you nailed it right on the head. From our Western philosophical tradition, we're always taught that God or the divine is something out there,
Mm-hmm.
and we're separated from that being in some way. So, and I think that gets back to the dualism. Whereas in Eastern philosophy, there's also a concept of monism, where you're one with
Oh.
the divine, you're part and parcel of God, and so
Similar,
specifically
similar to Martin
in
Buber, I and thou.
right, I
Right.
am, and that's a scary thought to a lot of people, to all of us. I know the way we're indoctrinated. So to break through that um, tendency, because even in a lot of my training, it's personalism, whereas there has to be a personal God and a relationship with that God, be
Mm-hmm.
it Krishna or another form of Vishnu. So
Or
Lord
it's too
Chaitanya and the Hare,
abstract. It's too abstract otherwise.
well, they say that the otherwise you're just merging with the oneness, and that's not the goal
Mm.
of the Vaishnav. Whereas he reconciled that with a concept called a chincha beta beta tattva, which is simultaneous oneness and difference. It's inconceivable. We're simultaneously one with God, but we're different than God. So we're a partial spark of that divine, and that creates the relationship. And there's three aspects. There's the Bhagavan, or the personal God, that's in his own realm with his own activities. Um, there's the Paramatma, or the super soul, which is within, and there's the oneness, which is everywhere. So I think Christianity focuses on just the personal God. So it's so difficult to, it's like the man upstairs, right? He's like out there, and then to see God in everything is difficult. But if you look at
And the Old
the
Testament
higher
God is even more remote.
right, right. But if you look at the higher teachings of uh, Thomas Aquinas, or some of these people who had these divine realizations, Francis of Assisi, they did feel that oneness. It's like that I am.
Yeah.
So to me, you have to go through those levels to get to the personal relationship.
So ultimately, it's not the recognition of the oneness, it's the lack of any recognition of anything else. It's not you thinking about it, it's the being of it. And so to think about it, I suppose, is to not quite be there yet.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. I've been listening to a lot of Eckhart Tolle lately, and he talks about the being and the doing. The being is the hard part when you're doing, because our culture is focused on the doing, just always be active.
Yeah.
Uh,
And that brings us right back
but
to the point again, which is, how do you operate in a world that does require tremendous financial obligations, personal obligations. We live in the world. And so how I think that's what I am trying to focus on here today is what have you gleaned from all of this, obviously, that you've studied, is the proper response to trying to balance our spiritual side of us with the bullshit that we have to deal with on our everyday level. But what do they? How do they address that?
I think they would say, do your duty and don't be attached to the results. That's the
Yeah,
entire
right.
purport of the Bhagavad Gita. You can read the
Yeah,
whole thing and go through karma yoga, which is action, jnana yoga, the yoga of knowledge and study.
right. Which is
So
the
to
same
be
thing.
in,
It's the same thing as Voltaire's Candide, where he goes at the end of the novel, ultimately having heard all the world's prevailing philosophies, concluding ultimately that he's going to have to go tend his garden, and that's about the end of it. It's the doing. And I think it summarizes in a very similar way that it's about the action as opposed to the ruminating.
yeah, and I think that goes to the Native American concept of
Okay.
everything you do, can it help another? Can it help the community? It's the doing.
Yeah.
And if you go sit on a mountaintop and meditate, that's great. You become, you become this enlightened being. But if you
Right.
don't come down
You'll
and help
sit
others,
right.
what good is it?
Right. I mean, if you sit up there and all you do is meditate, you'll have soiled pants. I mean, what good is it?
Well, you learn to control the bodily functions. I mean,
Oh, well.
there's
Well, I think I
if
was
we
talking more about the aspirants.
oh, I see, I see. Where Ram Dass's guru Neem Karoli Baba, he was in all uh, instances and testaments this enlightened being, but he would come down to the ashram. He'd just be sitting on a simple bed with a blanket, and then he would see the adherents. And Ram Dass talks about this story where he had gotten to the point where he had renounced money. Um, he was thinking he was this enlightened sadhu. He was living in an ashram that was a couple miles away, and he couldn't take the bus anymore, and he missed a ride, and he hated everybody that was around. He didn't want to be around all these people. He just wanted to be with his guru. And I've experienced this, like being in the ashram, where you get to the point where you're like, you don't want to be around any people. So he was walking down really angry about the whole situation, that now this guru he had made famous had superseded his relationship and all these other relationships there. And he comes down, and they offer him prashadam or holy food, and he just like throws the plate, and he breaks down in tears, and the guru hugs him, starts feeding him milk, and he said, what's wrong? And he said, well, you told me to love everyone and always tell the truth. And he goes, I can't love everyone and always tell the truth. And he just said, well, it's so simple. But I think that's the hard part, right? Like, we want to remove ourselves from all the mundane nonsense, and then we still have to deal with the so-called mundane nonsense. So
Yeah.
it's like, rise above it, don't be sullied by it, and surround yourself with the right people.
You can't isolate
And
yourself from it. It's part of the world.
right, and that's something I've struggled with my whole life. I mean, I've been in, ashram life, and then trying to negotiate so-called material life, and I go in deep either way, and here I am isolated on a hill, and I'm trying to figure out the material side again, and I'm having to do very difficult things. But if I like today, I woke up and I was like, power was out, it was early. I was like, should I drive to this ceremony? But it's 6 hours away, one way. That's not practical. That was my impulse. I had this gravitational pull, and I was like, I have to be responsible. Supposed to go to work tomorrow. I got to figure this out. I'm just taking it. Everything is a ceremony. then
Yes.
is the teaching, and it's only our minds that separate it.
Ah,
So
there you go.
if I look at going to work tomorrow, even though I don't want to, for a job that's incredibly physically demanding, then I can work through that. It's
Yeah.
part of whatever. And I wrote this morning, I think the hardest part of the spiritual path, if you're actually sincere, cheap spirituality is easy, but if you're actually sincere, the universe will conspire
Right.
to grate down that ego on the spiritual path. And that's the hardest part. It's like these things happen to us that we don't want to happen, but that's designed because you are sincerely seeking out that higher uh, source of yourself
Right. Do you
and
think
that
do you think it makes
connection
you
with the
more
universe.
does it ultimately end up making you too sensitive in the mundane world?
It certainly can, for sure.
Yeah.
It can make you sensitive. But that's not a bad thing if you're a sensitive person, meaning you're sensitive to others, you're empathic to
Yeah.
others' feelings.
The world in general.
You're shining the light. I mean,
Right.
was Bob Marley a sensitive person? Yes. Like you're a big fan of reggae, you know the history more than I do, but
But I also
he
know
was a
about Bob
light.
Marley. He was a very hard man who had no problem just whooping somebody if they crossed him, or that's the sort of environment he came up in. And I don't think he ever left that entirely behind either.
Right.
I mean,
Yeah,
one thing I would not do is romanticize Bob Marley as someone who lived as some sort of ascetic. He was a Rastafarian and a Jamaican, and I think he came up in that environment, and it didn't make him immune to some of the harshness that goes along with that.
but was he sensitive to the needs of others, would you say, or in his music
I
or
mean, I didn't know the man personally, obviously, so I couldn't possibly say. I think that you'd have to say explicitly through his music, his lyrics, everything that he worked for. The answer is yes. All he really did was use this music as a way to convey a message of strength and unity and love. And what often happens, and this is a topic for another day, is that the personal life of a man doesn't necessarily always mirror the public life. And that's true of Bob Marley, and not he was he was a tough guy. I mean, and that's what history has recorded about him, to his musicians, to his women, to his family, and by tough, I don't necessarily mean unfair or cruel either. If love is being honest and hard and all of that, then that goes along with it. But he was complicated, that's for sure.
yeah, it is complicated. And that's the medicine man, Lakota medicine man that I heard a quote from was saying people think if you're a Wachasa Khan, a holy man, a medicine man, then you don't have to experience all these things. But actually you're experiencing all the things of the world, the highs and the lows, the sins, the um the experiences that everybody else has to experience. Otherwise, how can you be empathetic with it? How can
Right.
you help people? It was an interesting concept because I think in the Eastern sense, we deify people as like a holy person that never, like in India, they'll say like he never had sex. He was celibate his whole life. He was never married. He was always religious from day one. And there's this great quote by Alan Watts that I like. He said, religion is not meant to be a revolving door. It doesn't mean you just get stuck in the door and become a really good Vaishnav or a really good Catholic or a really good Taoist or a really good Zen. It's meant to take you somewhere else, to grind down those parts of yourself that aren't meant to be there,
To propel you
that are
forward.
just the false ego.
To propel you
What's that?
forward. To propel you forward.
Right, right. To propel you forward. And you don't know what that forward is, but the universe does, or the divine does.
Well,
We think,
Western religion would tell you what that is. They're pushing you in a direction where they have a very specific outcome, as opposed to Eastern religion.
I mean, Eastern religion can have the goal as well, but what I'm saying is, if you're a really good whatever religious person considered externally, that doesn't mean you're doing the deep work that needs to happen um, to grind down that false ego or that identification with the false self. That's really just the external conditioning that we've experienced, right?
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does. It does. Sort of shaped by our experience and our environment.
No, that I mean that's a great point. And then the tendency is we always compare ourselves to others, thinking that they're materially doing better than us or spiritually doing better than us or whatever it is.
And
But
isn't that
we don't.
isn't that two things? That's our ego, and it's also to some extent the way our society has been constructed. It's constructed to be competitive. You're supposed to compete with your neighbor, and right. I mean, it's not just our ego. It is the culture that we are in, which speaks again back
Right.
to our topic, which is we know we're in this system. We know that it's designed this way. We know the healthcare system is designed in a certain way. Advertising, consumerism, materialism, all these things are forces at work just to live. So,
But that doesn't translate to the spiritual path, is my point. If you
well,
do that comparison,
so to refine this point, if you can't be spiritual in this, which is a pretty ruthless system, then you can't really be spiritual anywhere. So I think of it often as ruthless and difficult and challenging. However, you still have to operate as a spiritual person within that system, because what good is your spirituality unless it can operate within that system? So in other words, can we really?
that's true. But
Can you get away?
that's true. Good.
No, I was just going to finish that point. Like, can you get away? Can you actually? You can't really separate yourself from the mundane world.
But can you transcend it? And the spirituality, what I'm saying is, if you compare yourself to another person and think what they're doing is higher or lower, that goes back to the dualistic thinking and
Sure.
the competition.
So
Spiritual
you
life
haven't
is
really
not a
transcended anything. I don't think someone who, I mean, we all do it. We all have this kind of ego struggle, and we are all competitive and things like that. But clearly, and I don't claim to be, have any kind of, spiritual enlightenment to share or anything like that. I am just, trying to operate in the world like everyone else. But I recognize that about myself. So, here we are trying to understand it, to learn about it, to read about it. And then there is this very, very different experience of actually being in it. And I think that if I have personally ever experienced it, it's in the no thinking time. It's in the time of no thinking. And if that's either in the middle of a wonderful jam session in music, or if it's painting details on a painting, or if it's walking through the woods or spending time with someone that you really care for, those are the moments, right? What is it? Enlightenment is the space between your thoughts. Something along those lines.
Right. So then it's the being. It's all
right.
we have. All we have is the present moment.
Right.
And then how do you deal with that when the present moment's really hard?
And you know the answer to this already, but if we're to pose the question, how do you do that in the present moment? There is an answer. From like Thich Nhat Hanh, or I think they would just simply say, take a deep breath.
Be here now.
Right. Yeah. That's what taking a deep breath does. It's that union between your thoughts and your physical self. And once we, going back to again something that we started off with, there should not be necessarily a separation. We want to find the bridge between the two, between the mind and the body. And Western civilization has been constructed to separate those two things, much like we've been separated from the natural world.
Yeah, the medicine wheel in the Lakota tradition is the physical, the mental, the emotional, and the spiritual self, and those four parts all in balance. And you can look at those in different Western psychological ways or in Eastern philosophical ways. And I think that's always a struggle, keeping these things balanced. We were talking, I think we had a conversation uh, within the last couple weeks, and you were saying, I don't have any of these spiritual outlets you have. And then it made me feel better. Like I do have these things to help. But then I was talking to someone and they said, well, like you were saying, your spirituality could be in a jam session or going on a run or whatever that is. That is your
Yeah.
ceremonial outlet, your
Yes.
spiritual outlet, whatever you want to call it.
Right. So, kind of in a way, wrapping this around, here we have an American pragmatist, the philosopher John Dewey, saying every act is a religious act. Now, I've always understood that to mean he's not talking about religion like Judeo Christian religion. He's saying
Right.
that there's no difference between the sacred and the profane. That, you
Right.
could be using the
Right.
bathroom. You're not out of your spiritual mind just because you're using the bathroom and you're doing some bodily function. Uh, So,
Right.
so that's why when we wake up and we have to do things that we don't necessarily want to do, I suppose one helpful way to look at it is this is no different than I like what you said earlier. This is a ceremony. This is another ceremony. It's just, or it's part of the ceremony, and it may be tedious and repetitive, but there's it's hard to say this is or this is not, but there's no separation necessarily between those two.
Right. And I think the mind tells us that, but our culture tells us that too, in the way we were raised. So it's like using these other ceremonies or spiritual experiences to inform the rest of our life. And I still struggle with this because it's like I have a tendency where it's like, am I living to go to ceremony, or am I going to ceremony to learn how to live
Hmm.
better? And it's like that's two different things. And it's like I just want to be ideally, like I said, in ceremony or on the hill or meditating, and I don't want to have to do these other things, but I have to take care of these other things.
Well, this is sort of the beautiful teaching of reading that Jesus was washing the feet of the apostles. He's humbling himself. That's why the Pope kind of does that as well. I think like once a year or whatever it may be. But it's the same sort of gesture. It's the same symbol to humble. No matter how high you may be, you will always have to humble yourself all the way back down. Not everybody does that. And then the other thing I would say is that I don't know that everybody struggles with this balance because I don't think most people are even trying to find that balance. I think, and this is just an opinion, but on the whole, I think, of course, there's communities of people who are spiritually minded and trying to pursue it. But I do think, especially in our American culture, most people are not necessarily pursuing it. I think less and less people are pursuing it on a conventional level through conventional religion. That's a trend that's been going downward for quite some time. But in general, I think it's rare people who are even willing to dedicate themselves to such a spiritual pursuit.
Oh, you just made me feel special, Jeff. I appreciate that.
That's what I'm here to do.
See, that's that tricky ego again.
Yeah,
But we
but is it?
we
But
need that.
right. Yeah, go ahead. I'm sorry because I think you're going in the direction that I would head in. It's ego, but ego isn't necessarily bad. It's not like ego always has to be thrown in the trash can. It's part of our physiology.
And yeah, it allows us to propel ourselves forward, right? It's a neurological function. You have to put energy into something.
It's
So
neurological and
it's
biological. We have
it's no
communities, companions, relationships, families, all these different things rely on cooperation, rely on love and respect. I think those serve, not to be crass about it, but they serve certain biological needs.
Oh, for sure. Right. And Yeah, going back to the beginning, it is very few people that will uh, pursue a spiritual path in a very meaningful way.
Yes.
So, and that's not to say that, and that can take lifetimes, according to the philosophical understanding that you're coming from. Some people think we only have one chance, but that's,
But it's also the acceptance that there is no finish line. There's no goal. Once you
there is
embrace,
a right. You have to keep going. You're right. The finish line keeps getting
or
moved,
the
I would
finish
say.
line is an illusion. The goal is an illusion. Well, I don't have the Marcus Aurelius quote right on the tip of my tongue, but it's basically the idea that the impediment to the way is the way. And then there's
Mm.
another part of that great quote, which I can bring in later, but it's the impediment to the way that is the way. I can get it real quick.
The obstacle is the way. I mean, that's the the Ryan.
The impediment
Um,
to action. Here it is. This is Marcus Aurelius. The impediment to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way.
there you go.
Yeah. And that's because we separate the journey from the goal. And in our culture, we're very, very focused on the goal, but we're not focused on the long, arduous journey to get there. So I've had this thought in the past, which is we do young people a disservice telling them that they can do whatever they put their mind to. And I would say instead, what we should say is, you can do whatever you'd like as long as you're willing to spend thousands and thousands of hours on it with no guarantee of success.
Mm. Yeah, and that doesn't make sense to tell somebody that. It's not going to encourage them. Who's going to do that, right?
So you don't think I'm going to be a successful, like, multi-level marketer telling people that they have to spend thousands and thousands of hours on something and have no guarantee of success? I shouldn't say zero, but of course there's no, but that's kind of the thing. I mean, do you fall in love with the process? Can you fall in love with the process? Can you fall in love with the tedium?
Yeah, I mean the process of the spiritual steps, I think I've learned to fall in love with that. The process of the mundane, so-called mundane aspects of life that we're talking about, the working or making money, or these other things, I have to accept them as part of the process, right?
Yeah, right. So, Dan, I think that kind of brings us back home. I think we did address this question. You provided a tremendous amount of information in terms of from the context of Eastern philosophy and Native American tradition, in which there is a lot of discussion throughout the world of just this challenge. How do you balance your life if you are embracing spirituality, but you have to maintain the tedious nature of everyday life, especially in a materialistic, consumeristic culture like this one. I'd really like to thank you for being here and sharing your knowledge and sharing your experiences. I think it was a very productive, informative discussion. Certainly, we're going to continue discussing these things. And if people are interested, they can follow up at the website, Sans Apologia. And we'll also take a look at your questions, your comments, any emails that you send. And really do hope that you enjoyed the discussion. Thanks again, Dan.